The company and the house should all be handed over to me. I had lost my husband a few days ago, and my daughter-in-law, who suddenly showed up, was pressing me for demands. My husband had been the president of a company, and presumably my son, my daughter-in-law's husband, was expected to be the next president. Understood, but regarding the issues you two are involved in, I'll be filing a complaint, so be prepared for that.
What?
I had never imagined that my son and his wife could commit such unbelievable crimes. I am Zoe, now 54 years old. My husband, who at 56 was the president of a small but successful company. Despite its size, the company was performing well. I had the title of the president's wife, but didn't involve myself much in the business, helping with administrative tasks when my husband was busy. We had a 27-year-old son who worked at his father's company. I had hoped that marriage and having a family would bring some maturity, but that wasn't the case. His overconfidence in being the next president and his inadequate contribution to the company was quite apparent. Whenever I pointed this out, my son would temporarily change his behavior, but he would revert when his father wasn't around. As a parent, I was embarrassed by my son's attitude. My son's wife was a cheerful woman, and I never felt the typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law issues. Instead, it seemed like the daughter-in-law was avoiding me and my husband, keeping a certain distance. This might be considered a healthy distance, but I had always felt something off about it. My husband would dismiss my concerns, but I couldn't shake the feeling. One day I received a call that my husband had collapsed at work. Rushing to the hospital, I found my son, who had accompanied my husband in the ambulance from the company. The doctor explained my husband's condition: a progressive disease leading to muscle weakness and eventual inability to move or breathe independently. I knew about such diseases from TV and magazines, but I never imagined my husband would suffer from such a serious illness. The doctor said the condition had progressed significantly and asked if there had been any symptoms before. Reflecting on recent events, I realized my husband had been dropping things more often, and his way of holding spoons and forks during meals seemed a bit different. I had thought it was just due to fatigue from busy work, but it turned out to be a symptom of the disease. Even after the doctor's explanation, I was so shocked that I wasn't sure if I understood everything. I knew I needed to discuss the future with my son, but I was so overwhelmed by reality that I couldn't find the words to start. Feeling my body losing strength, my son suddenly stood up and said, "So I guess I can go home now, right?" Startled, I said, "What?" My son replied, "If the president collapses, things will get complicated, and my work will get busier. I don't think I can visit him, and I definitely can't do any caregiving, so don't ask me to." Even after hearing my son's words, I couldn't immediately comprehend what he was saying. Shocked by the severity of my husband's illness, my understanding had diminished. However, if I couldn't rely on my son, I might need some help from my son's wife. Regaining my composure, I called my daughter-in-law.
"Father-in-law, to think such a thing could happen."
My daughter-in-law seemed shocked by the sudden news, struggling for words. Yet she showed concern for me and offered words of encouragement. She even said about my husband,
"He will surely get better. Let's believe that."
It seemed my daughter-in-law understood my feelings, and there might be a chance she would help with my husband. I broached the main subject.
"I understand that taking care of my father-in-law is difficult, but we have our own lives too, and being asked to do something so suddenly..."
She started to speak with a distressed tone and ended up saying something similar to my son, then hung up the call. I couldn't move for a while, holding my disconnected phone. I wondered if my husband was the kind of person to be abandoned by his family, or were my son and his wife just too lacking in compassion? My daughter-in-law was a full-time housewife without children yet. I had assumed she could spare some time to help, but now that she had refused, I couldn't force her. Determined, I resolved to care for my husband by myself. While my husband was hospitalized, nurses took care of his needs, so my role was limited. Still, I made sure to be by his side, hold his hand, and talk to him as much as possible so he wouldn't feel lonely. After discharge, I and a helper would be responsible for my husband's care. So during the hospital stay, I observed the nurses to learn the necessary skills. Amidst this, my husband's condition gradually stabilized and we began home care. Shortly after returning home, my daughter-in-law, who hadn't visited even once during the hospitalization, suddenly appeared. Why now when she never visited unexpectedly, even when my husband was healthy? While I was pondering, my daughter-in-law casually remarked,
"Oh, he looks healthier than I thought."
Thinking it was a misunderstanding, I could only respond with, "What?" Then my daughter-in-law said,
"I thought it must be serious when I heard he was discharged. You know, like when people bring their family home for the last time?"
It was not a misunderstanding. My daughter-in-law had come just to see how far my husband's illness had progressed.
"So, now that you've brought him home, what are you planning to do?"
"What do you mean? We're going to live here while I take care of him with home care."
"Home care? Do you understand how much of a burden that is? Just so you know, I absolutely won't help with caregiving."
I didn't expect any help from my son and his wife since they had already clearly stated they couldn't help. So I told her about planning to rely on helpers and visiting nurses.
"Helpers and visiting nurses, huh? That sounds like it will cost a lot. I don't want you to spend too much on caregiving. It's a waste to spend money on someone with an incurable disease, with no hope of recovery."
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The money used for my husband's care was, of course, earned by him. It was only natural to use it for his sake. I never expected such insensitive remarks from someone who had married into the family, regardless of being an outsider. Especially when the person is actually sick. I couldn't believe these words were coming from a family member. Was this my daughter-in-law's true nature? Knowing this, I decided to limit any unnecessary interaction from now on. For a moment, I felt like giving up, but if I didn't stand firm, who would take care of my husband? I resolved to do my best for my husband so I wouldn't have any regrets. I planned to use all possible caregiving services and face the illness with my husband. Taking care of my husband made me realize that caregiving was also part of living with the disease. When his condition stabilized, we would rejoice together, and when it worsened, we would fight together. Caregivers share the same fate as the sick. We'll get through this together. I'll do my best, so please, you do your best too. However, despite my hopes, my husband's condition continued to deteriorate. I couldn't leave his side for a moment, fearing something might happen if I did. I tried contacting my son, hoping for any assistance, but was rejected just as before, with a cold voice saying, "It's none of my business." During these days, I received an unusual call from my husband's company. They reported that my daughter-in-law had been coming to the office, intimidating the young employees, and they were struggling to handle her. So, leaving the caregiving to a helper, I went to the company. Upon arrival, a longtime employee approached me, speaking in a hushed tone so as not to be overheard. Lately, my daughter-in-law had been frequently visiting the company, taking an arrogant attitude towards the young employees, sometimes even yelling at them. The longtime employees were troubled and at a loss with her behavior. Guided by an employee to the daughter-in-law's location, I found her yelling at a new employee.
"How many times do I have to tell you, you useless thing?"
I asked a longtime employee to wait there and approached my daughter-in-law. The new employees seemed intimidated and on the verge of tears. I told them to follow the longtime employee's instructions and to leave the area. Then, I took my daughter-in-law to a private spot and asked her what that was all about.
"What? I was just training the new employees."
"What? Why?"
"Because when the current president is gone, my husband will be the next president, right? I have to thoroughly educate any employees who might hold him back."
I was baffled. My husband and I had never once mentioned our son becoming the next president. We had not discussed passing the company to him either. I couldn't understand how things had come to this. My son and his wife were completely mistaken. This was an opportunity to clarify the future of the company to them. However, before I could speak, my daughter-in-law said she didn't have time to be involved with me and left. I needed to act quickly. I gathered more information from the longtime employees and those scolded by the daughter-in-law. It seemed my daughter-in-law frequently walked around the company yelling at employees. The employees mentioned that my daughter-in-law always targeted certain employees she disliked and treated them harshly. The scolded employees were even told,
"If you don't like it, quit. You won't get any severance pay, as it will be a voluntary resignation."
I was astonished that my daughter-in-law, who knew nothing about the company's work, could interfere so much. My daughter-in-law also meddled in matters outside of work and imposed unnecessary demands, causing significant trouble for the employees. I apologized to the new employees, promising to resolve the issue and asking them to stay with the company if possible. I also apologized to the longtime employees for the inconvenience and discussed the plans for the company that my husband and I had decided. A few days later, despite my diligent care, my husband passed away. I had braced myself for this day, but facing the reality was different. My mind understood, but my heart couldn't keep up. I wanted to forget everything, cling to my husband, and cry loudly. I wanted to hug my husband tighter than ever, telling him he had done well and that it had been hard. However, in front of the employees, I had to maintain my composure as the president's wife. I wondered how a normal family would handle such a situation. How would children feel seeing their mother stay strong in grief after their father's death? My son, of course, attended the funeral, but didn't help at all. He just sat with his wife, seemingly waiting for time to pass. On the other hand, the company's employees were helping a lot behind the scenes, like family members. The employees were busy with the reception of mourners and various procedures. Seeing their efforts, I managed to gather myself. As a result, I believe the wake and funeral turned out reasonably well. I noticed critical whispers from the visitors about the difference in attitude between the employees and my son and his wife. I agreed with these opinions, but pretended not to hear the whispers. While I was greeting the mourners, my son and his wife left without saying anything. A few days later, when I was still immersed in the aftermath of the wake and funeral, my son's wife came to her. My daughter-in-law demanded my husband's inheritance. When I asked, "What are you talking about?" my daughter-in-law shouted angrily,
"Don't play dumb. You've lived a comfortable life as the president's wife, haven't you? You've indulged in luxury, so you should renounce all the inheritance and give it all to my husband."
I knew the inheritance procedures had long been completed. Renouncing the inheritance, understood.
"So you understand. Then prepare to leave this house quickly."
My daughter-in-law looked genuinely pleased upon hearing my words. I had no intention of staying in the too large house alone. I told her I would move as soon as my belongings were packed, and my daughter-in-law happily relayed everything to my son over the phone. I did as I had told my daughter-in-law, packing my things and moving to a new place where I could live alone. Sometime later, while I was enjoying my solitude, my daughter-in-law called.
"What's this? Are you mocking us? My father-in-law's inheritance can't be this little. It's not pocket money for a child."
My daughter-in-law was also angry about the house being put up for sale and a longtime employee becoming the president of the company. She berated me over the phone, demanding an explanation. "What are you talking about? If I remember correctly, you were the one who wanted my husband's inheritance."
"Yes, that's right, but it can't be that little."
"No, the amount of my husband's inheritance is correct. Wasn't it you who referred to it as a child's allowance? That's indeed the inheritance he left behind. Was it too little, do you think?"
"Of course. You're hiding it all in your pocket. Hand it over."
"Now that's a terrible accusation. I haven't done such a thing. Like I promised before, I renounced the inheritance from my husband. You and my son inherited it. Didn't you? There's nothing wrong with that," I calmly explained. However, my daughter-in-law seemed unconvinced.
"All you talked about was your husband's inheritance. You never mentioned anything about my assets, did you?"
Here, I decided to tell her everything. The house we had lived in was originally purchased in my name. Therefore, my son and his wife had no right to it as part of the inheritance. The company where my husband was the president originally belonged to my father. And while my husband worked as the president, I was the chairperson. In the company hierarchy, the chairperson's position and authority are higher than the president's. Therefore, my husband didn't have much personal assets. I had told my son that my husband had married into my family, but I never explained the company details to him. If my son had changed his attitude and actively contributed to the company, things might have been different. But no matter how much I cautioned him, his behavior only worsened. Considering his character, I decided he wasn't suitable to run the company. It seems my husband shared my opinion. He selected a reliable employee from among those he cherished to serve as the new president. My daughter-in-law, upon hearing my story, was silent, probably in shock. Since she said nothing, I decided to address another matter. Also, you embezzled money from the company, didn't you? In collusion with my son.
What a thing to say! Embezzlement? That sounds so bad. It was going to be my husband's company. We just used a little money.
You used the company's money, right? That's called embezzlement. We caught it early this time. In return for not filing a report, my son was fired.
What? Fired? So what's my husband supposed to do now? Don't you feel sorry for your son? You're heartless.
My daughter-in-law hurled insults at me, with no sign of remorse or intent to change. Understanding this, I saw no point in continuing the conversation. I ended the call one-sidedly. My son and his wife seemed to believe that the company and the house would eventually be theirs, relying on this belief instead of saving money. They are young and childless, so they might manage somehow. My daughter-in-law, believing she would receive a substantial amount from my husband's inheritance, had planned to open her store. She borrowed money from various sources, expecting to become the president's wife soon. However, the inheritance turned out to be much less than anticipated, and her husband did not become the president, leading to the abandonment of her store plans. The store was still unfinished, leaving her with a significant amount of debt. Additionally, she had flaunted her status as the future president's wife, indulging in extravagant activities at nightclubs. At the same time, it was revealed that she had been unfaithful. This series of events resulted in my daughter-in-law being left with substantial debts and the exposure of her infidelity. Even my son, usually forgiving, was furious about the infidelity and divorced her without discussion. Subsequently, my daughter-in-law was abandoned by her lover, and unable to repay her dangerous loans, she fled from collectors. My son, finally understanding his situation, started looking for work through employment services. Despite his youth, his lack of skills limited his job options. He's been choosy about job offers and salaries, struggling to even get to interviews. He occasionally comes to me complaining, but I insist he must live on his efforts. If I helped him get a job, it would only be a burden on others. I do want to help my son, but given the circumstances, I've decided he should figure out how to be independent on his own. Right now, I just want to take things slow and cherish the moments I have with my husband. Maybe when things settle down, I'll consider starting another small company and give it my best effort.